The call came on a Tuesday morning in early July, while I was sitting at my desk going over the August bookings. I almost didn't answer. I had learned, over 12 years of marriage and 2 years of divorce, that phone calls from my former mother-in-law never arrived without some kind of damage attached to them. But I picked up anyway, because old habits have a way of outlasting the reasons that formed them. "I need you to understand something," she said, skipping hello entirely. Her voice carried that particular tone she reserved for conversations she had already decided the ending of before they began. Measured. Certain. The tone of a woman who had never once in her life considered that she might be wrong about something. "The family reunion is happening the last weekend of August. We've booked a resort up in Muskoka. The whole property, the main lodge, the lakeside cabins, the private dining room. It's going to be a proper celebration. Your father-in-law turned 75 and we want everyone there." I said nothing. I let her continue. "Your children are welcome, of course. We love those kids. But I think it would be better for everyone if you didn't come. Your ex-husband is bringing his girlfriend, and she's going to be formally introduced to the family that weekend, and I just think you understand how it is. It would be awkward. For the children, mostly. You do want what's best for the children, don't you?" I had been waiting for that last sentence. She always ended with the children. It was her favorite move, the way she folded my love for my own kids into a weapon and pressed it gently against my ribs. "I understand completely," I said. "Good. I knew you'd be reasonable. You always were the reasonable one." She hung up. I set the phone down on my desk and looked at the computer screen in front of me. The August bookings were still open. I scrolled down until I found the reservation that had come in 3 weeks earlier, a group booking under my former mother-in-law's name. The main lodge plus 4 lakeside cabins, the private dining room for Saturday evening, full catering package, kayak rentals, a guided nature walk on Sunday morning, deposit paid, balance due on arrival. I read the name on the reservation one more time. Then I picked up my coffee, leaned back in my chair, and looked out the window at the birch trees that lined the eastern edge of the property I had spent 7 years of my life building. I took a long, slow sip. Then I smiled. I should explain who I am, because none of what comes next makes any sense without it. My name is Claire. I am 35 years old. I grew up in a small town in northern Ontario, the daughter of a woman who cleaned other people's houses and a father who drove long-haul trucks until his back gave out when I was 11. We were not poor in the way that makes headlines, but we were poor in the quiet, daily way that shapes everything, the way you learn to be invisible so no one notices what you don't have, the way you get very good at appearing fine. I married into a family that was the opposite of everything I came from. My ex-husband's family had money, not obscene wealth, but the comfortable, established kind that comes with cottages and club memberships, and the absolute, unshakable belief that their way of doing things was simply how things were done. My mother-in-law had never worked a day in her adult life, and considered this a point of pride. My sister-in-law had married a developer, and spent most of her time renovating her house in Forest Hill. My ex-husband was an investment manager who wore the same 3 expressions in rotation: pleased, irritated, and distracted, and who had, 2 years ago, decided that our marriage was an inconvenience he no longer wished to maintain. He left. He took a significant portion of what we had built together, because that is what happens when one person in a marriage earns more visibly than the other. He took the house in the city. He took the car. He took his family's affection, which had never fully belonged to me to begin with. What he didn't take was the resort. 7 years before any of this, I had inherited a small, deeply run-down fishing camp on a lake north of Huntsville from my great-uncle, a man I had met exactly 4 times in my life, but who had apparently always admired what my mother called my stubbornness. The camp was 22 acres, a crumbling main lodge, 6 rotting cabins, a dock that listed badly to the left, and a view of the water that made my chest ache the first time I stood there in rubber boots in the mud of early spring and looked out at it. My ex-husband thought it was a liability. His mother called it that camp situation. My sister-in-law asked once, at a family dinner, whether we'd considered just selling the land, because land values in Muskoka were going through the roof, and surely it wasn't worth the effort of maintaining a property that needed so much work. I didn't argue. I had already by that point spent 8 months working with an architect, a contractor, and every cent of my inheritance and personal savings to begin the renovation. I did most of the administrative work myself in the evenings after the children were in bed. I held on to a part-time consulting job to cover the household expenses while I poured everything else into the property. I did not tell my in-laws how much progress we were making. I did not correct their assumption that the camp was simply a small, slightly embarrassing side project of mine that would probably come to nothing. By the time my marriage ended, the property had been fully transformed. The main lodge had 12 guest rooms, exposed beams, a stone fireplace the size of a small room, and a dining hall that a Toronto food magazine had described as unexpectedly sophisticated. The 6 original cabins had been rebuilt as 4-season lakeside suites. There was a dock, a boathouse, a wood-fired sauna, and a fleet of canoes and kayaks. We had been fully booked every August for the past 3 summers. My ex-husband's lawyers had reviewed my assets during the divorce. The resort had been registered in my name alone from the beginning, my great-uncle's gift, my investment, my work. They couldn't touch it. My ex-husband had tried, briefly, to argue that it had been a marital asset. His own lawyers had told him he had no case. He had settled for the city house and moved on. His family had been told very little about any of this. What they knew was that I ran some kind of small property up north. They knew it was in Muskoka. They did not know the name. They had never asked, and I had never offered. In their minds, I was the ex-wife, the tolerated, occasionally pitied, quietly dismissed ex-wife who was raising 2 children in a rented townhouse and scraping by on whatever consulting work she could find. The picture they had of my life was one I had never bothered to correct. When my mother-in-law had called the resort 3 weeks earlier to make her booking, she had spoken to my front desk manager. She had given her credit card information to my reservations coordinator. She had requested the private dining room from a woman who had worked for me for 4 years, and who, when she saw the name on the booking, had walked directly into my office and quietly closed the door behind her. "You're going to want to look at this one," she had said. She was right. I spent the 2 weeks before the reunion doing nothing differently than I would have done for any other group booking. I confirmed the reservation. I arranged the catering. I scheduled the nature walk and the kayak rentals. I made sure the lakeside cabins were immaculate. I assigned their group the best table in the dining room for Saturday evening. I did all of this with the same professional thoroughness I brought to every booking, and I told my staff exactly one thing, that I would be present on site for that weekend, and that they should treat every member of the group exactly as they would treat any other guest. I did not tell them why. They were good people and they trusted me and they did not press. The family arrived on the Friday afternoon of the August-long weekend. I was in the main lodge when the first cars turned up the laneway, 2 SUVs and a luxury sedan, doors opening before the vehicles had fully stopped. I watched from the window of my office, which looked out over the front entrance. My mother-in-law got out of the first car. She was wearing a linen blazer and carrying a large hat, and she stood in the gravel and looked up at the main lodge with an expression. I recognized the expression of someone recalibrating their expectations upward more quickly than they were comfortable doing. She had clearly expected something modest, a pine-paneled relic with squeaky screen doors and a smell of mildew. What she was looking at was something else entirely. My sister-in-law got out of the second SUV and stood beside her mother. She tilted her head slightly, in the way people do when they are looking at something and trying to decide how to respond to it. Then she took out her phone and began photographing the exterior of the lodge. That was when I knew she was going to be a problem. My ex-husband arrived in the sedan with his girlfriend, a woman I had never met but had seen photographs of, tall, polished, the kind of effortless presentation that suggested significant maintenance. She looked around at the property and smiled in a way that seemed genuine, which I will admit surprised me. My children had been dropped off the previous morning and were already out on the water with 2 of my guides, sunburned and happy. I had arranged this deliberately. I wanted them as far from the front entrance as possible when their father's family arrived. I let my front desk manager check the group in. I stayed in my office. I had things to do, and I was not ready to make my presence known. Not yet. There was a patience required for what I had in mind, the same patience I had applied to every other difficult thing in my life, and I had been practicing it for 35 years. The first incident happened within an hour of their arrival. My sister-in-law came to the front desk to request that one of the cabins be switched because the view from hers was not what she'd expected. My front desk manager, with perfect composure, explained that the other lakeside cabins were all occupied by other guests, and that the cabin she had been assigned was in fact our finest suite, with the longest unobstructed view of the water on the entire property. My sister-in-law expressed this back to her in different words, her own words, and what she said was that she found it hard to believe that a place like this would have been fully booked in August, implying, without quite saying, that my manager was lying. My manager smiled and offered to show her the occupancy board. My sister-in-law declined and walked away. I heard about this from my manager 10 minutes later. I thanked her and asked her to note the interaction. She gave me a quiet, knowing look and went back to her desk. The second incident happened that evening at dinner. I had arranged for the private dining room to be set with the full table white linen, local wildflowers, candles, the whole presentation that our Saturday evening catering package included. The chef had prepared a meal using produce from farms within 40 kilometers, a detail we included in the printed menu because our guests generally appreciated it. The wine list had been curated by a sommelier I had brought in from the city 2 summers ago, and it was, I was told by people whose opinions I respected, genuinely excellent. I was seated at a small table in the main dining room, near the window that looked out over the water, when my mother-in-law walked through. She was heading toward the private room, but she stopped when she saw me. The look on her face moved through several stages in quick succession. Surprise, confusion, a rapid recalculation, then something that settled, uncomfortably, into a kind of forced pleasantness. "Claire," she said, "what are you doing here?" "I'm staying here," I said. "I do most summers. It's a beautiful property." You're a guest here?" "Something like that," I said. She looked at me for a moment longer, and I could see her working through something, deciding whether my presence here was a challenge to be addressed or a coincidence to be absorbed and moved past. She chose the second option. "Well," she said, "I suppose it's a small world." "It really is," I agreed. She went into the private dining room. I turned back to my window. I had not planned to reveal anything that evening. I had planned to let the weekend unfold, to let them enjoy the property, to let them have the celebration they had come for, and then, at the right moment, at the moment of my choosing, to allow them to understand what they had been standing in the middle of. Patience had always been my strongest quality. Even as a child, I had understood that the right moment arrived only if you were willing to wait for it. But the moment arrived sooner than I had expected, and it arrived not because of me, but because of my sister-in-law. Saturday passed without incident. My children spent the day with their father on the water, and I watched from a distance and was glad to see them laughing. I occupied myself with the ordinary work of running the property, a maintenance check on the boathouse roof, a meeting with the chef about the Sunday brunch menu, a phone call with a supplier in Barrie. I was busy and purposeful, and I felt, as I always did, when I was working, entirely like myself. Saturday evening, however, changed things. I was in my office when I heard raised voices coming from the direction of the main lodge entrance. I stepped out into the corridor and found my sister-in-law standing at the front desk, her voice pitched at the volume people use when they want to be overheard, speaking to my front desk manager in a way that made the back of my neck go tight. The issue, as it was explained to me afterward, was this. My sister-in-law had decided she wanted a late checkout on Sunday, not the standard 11 o'clock, but a 3 o'clock checkout, because she wanted to use the sauna in the morning and then have a full afternoon on the dock before driving back. My manager had explained, politely, that the Sunday 3 o'clock would not be possible because the cabins needed to be prepared for guests arriving Sunday evening, and that the 11 o'clock checkout was firm. My sister-in-law had escalated this into a complaint about the management of the property generally, the inflexibility of the staff, the inadequacy of the facilities given the price point, and had concluded by saying that she intended to leave a review that would accurately reflect the experience. I walked to the front desk. My sister-in-law saw me and stopped mid-sentence. "Is everything all right?" I asked my manager. "We were just discussing checkout times," my manager said, with extraordinary calm. I looked at my sister-in-law. She looked at me. Something shifted behind her eyes, the same recalibration I had seen in her mother's face the night before, but faster and less certain this time. "I didn't realize you were still here," she said. "I live here," I said. And then, because the moment had arrived, and because I had waited long enough, I added, "I own the property." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture to it. My sister-in-law opened her mouth and then closed it. She looked at my manager, as though my manager might contradict me. My manager looked back at her with the same composed expression she had been wearing all weekend. "The checkout time is 11, I said. My manager already explained this, and she was entirely correct. If you'd like to use the sauna Sunday morning, I'd suggest booking it before 9. It fills up quickly. I turned and walked back toward my office. I heard my sister-in-law say something behind me, but I did not stop. My manager, I was told later, handled the rest of the conversation with her characteristic grace. Word traveled, as it always does in small groups. By Sunday morning, the atmosphere over the family's breakfast had shifted considerably from what it had apparently been on Friday evening. I knew this because my dining room staff gave me a brief, understated account of the morning service, the quiet that had fallen over the table, the way my former mother-in-law had kept glancing toward the door, the way my ex-husband had said very little and stared mostly at his coffee. I arrived at the private dining room just before 10 o'clock, when the breakfast service was winding down. Most of the family was still at the table. My mother-in-law saw me first, then my ex-husband, then his girlfriend, who, to her credit, looked more curious than anything else. I sat down at the head of the table. It was, after all, my table. "Good morning," I said. No one said anything for a moment. My ex-husband set down his coffee cup with a small, careful click. "Is it true?" my mother-in-law asked. Her voice was different from the voice she had used on the phone 2 weeks earlier. The certainty was still there, but something underneath it had loosened. "Which part?" I asked. "That you own this property." "Yes," I said. "I've owned it for 7 years. I built the lodge, the cabins, the sauna, the dining room. I designed the renovation with my architect. I hired every staff member in this building. I have been running this property every summer since my children were small, while your son was living in the city house and telling people I was struggling." My ex-husband looked at the table. "You never said," my mother-in-law said. "No one ever asked," I said. "You told me very clearly 2 weeks ago that I was not welcome at this reunion. You booked the property. You didn't know whose property it was. That's not something I arranged, that was your decision. But I want you to understand something." I looked at her steadily. "You have been eating in my dining room, sleeping in my cabins, swimming in my lake. Your grandchildren, my children, have been on the water all weekend with guides I trained and trust completely. Every single person who has looked after your family this weekend works for me." My mother-in-law said nothing. The flush that had started at her collar was working its way up toward her face. "I am not asking you to leave," I continued. "You have paid for the weekend and you are welcome to enjoy Sunday checkout at 11, as my manager already communicated. What I am telling you is the truth about who I am, because I have been waiting for a long time for the right moment to tell you, and this is it." My sister-in-law started to say something. I could see her mouth opening, saw the familiar lean forward that preceded one of her speeches, and my mother-in-law put a hand on her arm. That stopped her. I had not seen my mother-in-law do that before. It surprised me, and I found to my own surprise that I was glad she had. My ex-husband looked up from the table. He looked at me for the first time all weekend, really looked, the way people look when they are trying to reconcile 2 images of the same person that don't line up. I had nothing to say to him. We had said everything we needed to say to each other in lawyers' offices 2 years ago. His girlfriend and I give her full credit for this, said quietly. "It's a beautiful property. You've done incredible work." "Thank you," I said. I meant it. I stood up, pushed my chair in, and walked out of the dining room, through the main lodge, and out the front door into the morning. The lake was silver, and still in the early light. The birch trees along the eastern edge caught the sun, and held it. 2 loons were calling somewhere out on the water, that long, looping call that is the sound of the North Country, the sound of everything that had been here long before any of us arrived, and would be here long after. I walked down to the dock and sat on the end of it, and I let the morning be what it was. My children found me there an hour later, running down the dock in bare feet, still in their pajamas, loud with something they had seen from their cabin window. "An osprey," my daughter said, "with a fish." They tumbled into me, and I put my arms around both of them and looked out at the water with them and let them tell me everything. The family checked out at 11, as scheduled. My front desk manager handled it with the same steady professionalism she had brought to everything else that weekend. My mother-in-law left without speaking to me again. My sister-in-law left without leaving a review, which I noted with quiet satisfaction. My ex-husband paused at the front door on his way out, and I could see from across the lobby that he was going to say something. I watched him make the decision and then unmake it. He walked to his car, got in, and drove away. His girlfriend paused beside me on her way to the parking lot. She was carrying a small canvas tote with our logo on it. We sold them in the gift shop, and she stopped and looked at me with an expression that was something between admiration and sadness. And she said, "He doesn't know what he gave up, does he?" "He made his choices," I said. "I made mine." She nodded. She seemed like a reasonable person. I hoped genuinely that she would be good to my children. That was the only thing that mattered to me anymore. The last car left the laneway at 11:23. I watched it go from the window of my office. Then I turned back to the desk, pulled up the September bookings, and went back to work. There is a version of this story where I spend a lot of time being angry about what happened, where I lie awake cataloging the years of small dismissals, the dinners where my ideas were absorbed into the conversation without credit, the holiday gatherings where I stood slightly outside the circle of their ease and wondered what exactly it was that I had done wrong. I spent time in that version for a while. It is a natural place to land when you have been treated as though you are less than you are. But anger is expensive, and I had spent enough of it already. What I had built up here, on this lake, in this property, was not built out of the desire to prove anything to anyone. I had not transformed this place so that one day I could deliver a speech in a private dining room and watch someone flush with shame. I had done it because it was mine. Because my great-uncle had seen something in me before I had learned to see it in myself. Because the first time I stood on this land in the mud of spring, I felt something unlock in my chest that had been shut for a very long time. My former mother-in-law had called me the reasonable one. She had meant it as a compliment and as a dismissal at the same time, the way people do when they want you to be both grateful and contained. What she had never understood, what most people who underestimate someone patient never understand, is that patience and weakness are not the same thing. They are, in fact, nearly opposites. I am patient because I know where I am going. I always have. The summer had 2 more weeks in it. The August bookings were full. The weekend after the family left, the lodge was filled with a retirement celebration for a woman who had spent 40 years teaching elementary school and whose former students had pooled their money to give her this. They were loud and wonderful, and they laughed the entire weekend. And on Sunday morning they gathered on the dock in the early light and sang something slow and harmonized, and their voices carried out over the water, and I stood in the doorway of the boathouse and listened, and I thought, this is what I built it for. This. Exactly this. My children come up most summers now, and they have begun to learn the property the way children learn a place they love, the name of every dockboard, the precise location of the best fishing spot, the particular quality of the silence that settles over the lake after midnight when the last bonfire has burned down. My daughter has told me she wants to run it one day. My son has told me he wants to design a new sauna. I have told them both that we have time, that there is no hurry, that the best things are built slowly. I believe this. I have always believed it. Somebody asked me once, not long after the divorce was finalized, whether I regretted the years I had spent inside that family, inside a marriage that was always weighted slightly to one side. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. What I said was this: I do not regret anything that brought me to this dock, to this water, to these children. I do not regret the patience I practiced, even when it cost me. I do not regret the silence I kept, even when speaking would have been easier. I do not regret the property my great-uncle left me, or the years of early mornings and long nights I poured into it, or the architect who told me the main beam in the lodge was irreplaceable and then watched me figure out how to replace it. I do not regret a single stone in this building. What I have learned, at 35, after everything, is that the most important thing you will ever build is not for anyone to see until the moment you decide to show them. Keep it close, keep it quiet. Keep working on it in the dark, in the mud, in the early mornings when no one is watching. The view from the dock at dawn is worth every single day of it.